How could an order of mendicant preachers, men who had taken a solemn vow of absolute poverty, become the architects of the most sophisticated and lucrative system for the confiscation of property in human history? And how did their archives come to hold interrogation protocols where a Dominican inquisitor, in his zeal to trap a victim, uses arguments so dangerously subtle they are almost indistinguishable from the very heresy he seeks to destroy? These are not contradictions. They are the engine of a story that begins in fire and ends in the silent, chilling hum of a machine that has never truly been turned off. It is the story of the Dominicanes, the hounds of the Lord, unleashed upon a world they sought not merely to guide, but to own, body and soul. Their story is a testament to a terrifying truth. The most dangerous tyranny is not born of ignorance, but of an unshakable certainty in one's own righteousness. The tale begins in the early 13th century in the sun-drenched, rebellious lands of Languedoc in southern France. This was not the France of kings and courts, but a vibrant civilization of poets, troubadours and merchants. It was also the heartland of a belief system so alien to Rome that it was seen as a cancer, gnawing at the very soul of Christendom. They called themselves the Cathars, the Pure Ones. They believed the material world was a trap, a prison created not by God but by an evil demiurge. They rejected the sacraments, the priests, the opulent churches, and the very authority of the Pope. For them, the Catholic Church was not the bride of Christ, but the whore of Babylon, draped in gold and drunk on power. For decades, Rome had tried to reason with them, sending preachers and legates. They all failed, their arguments swallowed by the deep, resonant faith of the Cathars. Into this cauldron of dissent stepped a Spanish nobleman, a priest of austere habits and burning eyes named Domingo de Guzman, later known as Saint Dominic. He arrived with a radical idea. He saw that the Pope's emissaries failed because their lavish lifestyles contradicted their message of apostolic poverty. The Cathar leaders, the perfecti, lived lives of extreme asceticism, earning the respect of the people. Dominic decided to fight fire with fire. He and his first followers would adopt a life of absolute poverty. They would own nothing. They would beg for their food. They would walk the roads barefoot, debating the heretics in town squares, in barns, in the shadow of their fortified castles. His method was intellectual combat, his weapon, the word. For a time, it seemed like a noble, if futile, endeavor. But the word was not enough. The heresy was too entrenched, the local lords too protective of their independence from both the French crown and the Roman pontiff. The turning point came in the year 1208 with the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau. Pope Innocent III, a pontiff of immense ambition and ruthless will, lost his patience. If persuasion had failed, then coercion would prevail. He called for a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against Christians in the heart of Europe. The Albigensian Crusade was unleashed, a storm of violence that would rage for 20 years, drowning Languedoc in blood and fire. Knights from northern France, hungry for land and salvation, descended upon the south, besieging cities and slaughtering their inhabitants with pious ferocity. Dominic and his small band of preachers witnessed this horror firsthand. They walked through smoking ruins and fields littered with the dead. They saw the limits of theological debate in a world governed by the sword. And something inside Dominic shifted. He realized that to save souls, one first needed to control bodies. To defeat a deeply held idea, one needed more than just a better argument. One needed an organization. An army of the mind, as disciplined and mobile as the crusading knights, but armed with scholastic logic and unshakable dogma. In the year 1216, in the midst of this brutal war, Pope Honorius III officially recognized Dominic's burgeoning community as the Order of Preachers. They were given a simple, stark mandate to preach the gospel and to extirpate heresy. The Dominicans were a new breed of monastic. Unlike the Benedictines, tied to their landed monasteries, the friars' preachers were urban, mobile, and intellectual. Their convents were established in the burgeoning university towns, Paris, Bologna, Oxford. They were not meant to be contemplatives hiding from the world. They were meant to be soldiers fighting within it. They studied Aristotle and Aquinas, becoming master logicians and debaters. They were trained to dissect an argument, to spot the slightest deviation from orthodox thought, to turn an opponent's words against them. They honed their minds into weapons of razor sharpness. The devil, they argued, promised humanity knowledge. The Dominicans would prove that all knowledge except their own led directly to the devil. Their initial work was subtle, almost like espionage. They moved among the people, listening. They gathered information, compiled lists of suspected heretics, and noted their networks and hiding places. They were creating a database of dissent, a map of the enemy's spiritual territory. They became the eyes and ears of the papacy in every corner of Europe. They understood that true power wasn't just in the crusaders' sword, but in information. They learned to identify the whispers of doubt, the quiet conversations that could blossom into full-blown rebellion against the Church. This was the prototype of the inquisitorial investigation, born not in a courtroom, but in the alleyways and marketplaces of a war-torn land. The Albigensian Crusade eventually crushed the Cathars as a political and military force. The castles fell, the nobles were dispossessed, and the land was annexed by the French crown. But the idea, the heresy itself, went underground. It survived in whispers, in secret meetings, in the hearts of those who had seen their world burn. The Church had won the war, but it was in danger of losing the peace. The bishops responsible for policing the faith in their dioceses were often lazy, corrupt, or simply overwhelmed. A more centralized, more efficient, more ruthless tool was needed to hunt down the last embers of heresy before they could reignite. In Rome, the popes watched these developments with growing alarm. The specter of heresy haunted them. It was a spiritual plague that threatened to unravel the entire fabric of Christendom. They needed a special forces unit, a papal Gestapo, loyal only to them, unbound by local politics and feudal obligations. They needed men who were intelligent enough to understand the subtleties of heresy, zealous enough to pursue it without hesitation, and disciplined enough to act as a single, coordinated body across the entire continent. They needed a perfect weapon. The man who would find and forge that weapon was Pope Gregory IX. Ascending to the papal throne in 1227, he was a shrewd canon lawyer and a man of inflexible will. He saw the patchwork of episcopal courts as inadequate for the scale of the threat. He needed an institution that could operate anywhere, with supreme authority answering only to him. He looked across Europe, assessing the tools at his disposal. He saw the ambitious bishops, the greedy princes, the unruly monastic orders. And then he saw the Dominicans, young, hungry, brilliant, and fanatically devoted to the Holy See. They were the answer to his prayers. They were the weapon he had been looking for. What would you choose if forced? The public shame of a heretic's robe or the secret agony of the torture chamber? Tell us your grim choice in the comments below. Pick your poison, shame, or pain. Your confession is safe with us. The Dominicans became that weapon with terrifying speed. In a series of papal bulls issued in the 1230s, Pope Gregory IX systematically removed the prosecution of heresy from the hands of the bishops and placed it into the care of his new papal inquisitors, overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of the order of preachers. This was a legal revolution. The Dominicans were now answerable to no one but the Pope. They were not bound by local laws or customs. A Dominican inquisitor could arrive in a town and demand that the local authorities, from the mayor to the duke, assist him in his sacred duty. To refuse was to risk being branded a protector of heretics, a crime almost as grave as heresy itself. They were untouchable, a supranational police force with a divine mandate. The hounds of the Lord were finally off the leash. The system they created was a masterpiece of legal terror. It inverted every principle of justice known at the time. The accused was not presumed innocent. Their very accusation was evidence of likely guilt. The proceedings were secret. The accused was never told the names of their accusers. They were not permitted a lawyer for the simple and chilling reason that to defend a heretic was to be guilty of heresy oneself. The inquisitor was not an impartial judge. He was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury all rolled into one. His sole task was not to determine guilt or innocence, but to secure a confession. A confession was paramount, not just for the soul of the heretic, but for the legitimacy of the Inquisition itself. It was proof that the system worked. To secure this all-important confession, the inquisitors developed a sophisticated arsenal of psychological and physical coercion. The interrogation was a carefully staged drama of despair. The accused would be isolated for weeks or months in a dark cell, deprived of contact with their loved ones. Then they would be brought before the inquisitor, who would alternate between feigned kindness, promising mercy in exchange for a full confession, and terrifying threats of the pyre that awaited the unrepentant. He would present them with a tangled web of accusations, mixing truth and lies, forcing them to guess who had betrayed them. Was it their neighbor, their business partner, their own spouse or child? Silence was interpreted as obstinacy. A denial was proof of a hardened heart. Every word was a potential trap. And if psychological pressure failed, there was always torture. Authorized by Pope Innocent IV in the year 1252 with the bull Ad Extirpanda, torture became a standard tool of the inquisitorial process. It was not meant to be a punishment, the Dominican theologians carefully explained, but merely a means of eliciting the truth from a reluctant witness. Devices like the strappado, which dislocated the shoulders, the rack, which stretched the limbs, and the water cure, which simulated drowning, were applied with methodical precision by lay executioners under the watchful eye of the friars. The inquisitors were often forbidden from shedding blood themselves, a piece of legalistic hypocrisy that allowed them to maintain a veneer of spiritual detachment while supervising scenes of unimaginable agony. The only limit was that torture should not result in death, a rule often broken in the dungeon's depths. The first generation of Dominican inquisitors were men of terrifying zeal. In Germany, Conrad of Marburg, a man of such fanatical asceticism that he regularly had himself whipped, unleashed a reign of terror. He traveled the Rhineland delivering verdicts with lightning speed. He gave the accused a simple choice: confess to heresy and be executed, or deny it and be executed. His crusade ended only when he made the mistake of accusing a powerful count, who had him ambushed and killed on a lonely road. In northern France, a former heretic turned Dominican named Robert le Bougre, Robert the Bugger, a slur for the Cathars, conducted mass burnings with ecstatic fervor. In one day, in 1239, he had 183 people burned at the stake at Montémay in Champagne. His own excesses eventually led to his downfall and imprisonment, but not before he had demonstrated the horrifying efficiency of the new machine. These early inquisitors were pioneers of paranoia. Their arrival in a town was preceded by a time of grace, a period of a few weeks where heretics could voluntarily confess in exchange for a lighter penance. This was a brilliant psychological move. It encouraged a flood of self-denunciations and, more importantly, denunciations of others. To prove the sincerity of their own repentance, confessed heretics were required to name all their accomplices. This set off a chain reaction of accusations, tearing communities apart. Friend turned against friend, family against family. No one could be trusted. The architecture of fear was being built, brick by brick, upon the foundation of suspicion and betrayal. A single anonymous denunciation was enough to bring a person into the dungeons of the tribunal, from which very few would emerge unscathed. The system was designed not just to punish, but to utterly break the individual. An accused person who confessed, repented, and named others might have their life spared. They would not, however, go free. They could be sentenced to wear the San Benito, a yellow tunic of shame painted with crosses or devils, for the rest of their lives. They might be condemned to a pilgrimage to a faraway shrine, or, most feared of all, to perpetual imprisonment. The Inquisition's prisons were brutal, often consisting of small, lightless cells where inmates were chained to the wall and fed on bread and water. A sentence of perpetual imprisonment rarely meant a lifetime. It meant as long as one could survive the disease, starvation, and despair. This methodical cruelty, however, posed a problem. As the Inquisition's activities expanded, a lack of consistency became apparent. One inquisitor in Toulouse might use different methods and pass different sentences than another in Lombardy. The techniques were effective but localized, dependent on the personality and experience of the individual inquisitor. For the Inquisition to become a truly universal and timeless institution, it needed to move beyond the improvisations of its early firebrands. It needed a corporate memory. It needed a rule book. It needed to transform the art of the heretic hunter into a cold, replicable science. What was needed was an executioner's handbook. The Dominicans, with their scholarly bent and their obsession with systematization, were uniquely suited to this task. They began to compile their knowledge, turning anecdotal experience from the interrogation chamber into meticulously organized manuals. These were not theological treatises for public consumption. They were classified documents, practical guides for the professional inquisitor circulated within the order. They were the codification of terror, handbooks that taught a new generation of friars not only what heresy was, but exactly how to root it out, how to break the will of its adherents, and how to stage manage their destruction. These books would transform the Inquisition from a series of ad hoc tribunals into a standardized pan-European network of ideological control. The most famous and influential of these sinister texts was the Practica Inquisitionis Heretice Pravitatis, or the Practice of the Inquisition of Heretical Depravity, compiled around the year 1323 by the Dominican Inquisitor of Toulouse, Bernard Guy. Guy was no wild-eyed fanatic like Conrad of Marburg. He was a patient, meticulous bureaucrat, a man who had spent decades in the job. His book is not a work of impassioned rhetoric. It is a calm, dispassionate, and utterly chilling procedural manual. It reads like a modern field guide for a secret police agent. It describes the beliefs and practices of various heretical groups, Cathars, Waldensians, the spiritual Franciscans, with anthropological precision, not to understand them, but to better dismantle their arguments and trap them in their own words. Guy provides detailed instructions for every stage of the process. He explains how to organize a tribunal, how to summon witnesses, and how to record testimony. He offers a catalogue of trick questions and interrogation tactics. For example, when questioning a suspected Waldensian who believed in adhering literally to the Gospels, he advises asking, "Is it permissible to swear an oath under any circumstances?" If the suspect says no, citing the Gospel of Matthew, they have revealed themselves. He instructs the inquisitor to feign sympathy, to promise that a full confession is the only path to salvation, and to never reveal the full weight of the evidence against the accused, keeping them disoriented and fearful. It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The truth is not a goal to be discovered, but a product to be manufactured. These manuals also contained detailed taxonomies of torture. They specified which methods were most effective for which types of suspects. A stubborn man might require the rack, while a woman might be broken more easily by the strapado. The authors, like Guy, or later, the Spanish Inquisitor Nicolau Aymeric, author of the hugely influential Directorium Inquisitorum, wrote with the cold precision of a surgeon. They provided advice on how to have a doctor present to ensure the victim did not die prematurely, and how to record the screams and pleas for mercy as evidence of the devil's hold over the unrepentant sinner. The key was to apply torture with prudence and measure, stopping just short of permanent mutilation or death, so that the process could be repeated if necessary. These books transformed justice into a technology of pain. The circulation of these manuscripts created a professional caste of inquisitors across Europe. A young Dominican in his convent in Cologne could study the techniques perfected by his brothers in Carcassonne. The Inquisition developed a shared methodology, a common language of oppression. This knowledge was taught in the Dominican Studia Generalia, the order's elite universities. Alongside theology and philosophy, novices learned the practical science of destroying the enemies of the faith. They learned how to build a case from whispers, how to manage a network of informants, and how to interpret a suspect's weary silence as irrefutable proof of guilt. They were being trained not just as priests, but as detectives, prosecutors, and executioners for God. This systematization also created a formidable bureaucracy. The Inquisition was a machine of paper. Every denunciation, every interrogation, every sentence was recorded in meticulous detail by a team of notaries. These vast archives became the Inquisition's most powerful weapon. They contained genealogies of heresy, tracking suspect families through generations. A man could be arrested in Milan based on the confession of a distant relative extracted 50 years earlier in Montpellier. The records allowed inquisitors to see patterns, to map networks of dissent, and to pursue their targets with relentless patience. It was the first great intelligence agency in European history, and its files were a death warrant for thousands. This bureaucratic efficiency had another, even more sinister effect. It dehumanized the process. The inquisitor was not just a man passing judgment on another, he was an official following a procedure, a functionary in a vast, impersonal machine. The manuals provided a script, a set of rules that distanced him from the human suffering he was inflicting. He was not being cruel, he was applying paragraph 4, section B, of the established procedure for questioning a relapsed heretic. This bureaucratic buffer made it possible for educated, intelligent men to commit acts of monstrous cruelty while believing they were merely doing their job, serving a higher good. They were cogs in a machine designed to purify the world, and the screams from the basement were merely the sound of the machine working. The ultimate goal of this entire process, as the handbooks made clear, was the public spectacle of the sermo generalis, or auto da fe, the act of faith. This was not just a sentencing, it was a carefully choreographed piece of liturgical theatre. It was held in the main town square, attended by church and civic leaders and a massive crowd. The condemned were paraded through the streets in their robes of shame. A sermon was preached, the sentences were read aloud, and the repentant were publicly reconciled. Then the unrepentant, or relapsed, heretics were relaxed. A chilling euphemism for being handed over to the secular authorities for execution, for the Church, in its infinite mercy, did not kill. The secular arm was then expected to burn the condemned at the stake, usually on the same day. This spectacle was the ultimate expression of the Church's power, a terrifying lesson for all who might be tempted to stray from the one true path. These sinister books, with their cold instructions and bureaucratic logic, represented the perfection of the inquisitorial system. They had turned a holy war into a smoothly running administrative process. They provided the blueprint for an architecture of fear that would soon cover the continent. With this knowledge codified and disseminated, the Dominicans were ready to expand their operations on an unprecedented scale. They had the mandate from the Pope and the methodology from their own experts. All they needed now was the infrastructure and the resources to build their empire of faith and fear, a spiderweb of tribunals that would ensnare anyone who dared to think differently. The spread of this Dominican-led spiderweb was astonishingly rapid. By the end of the 13th century, permanent Inquisition tribunals were operating in major cities across Italy, France, the German lands, and the kingdoms of Spain. Each tribunal was a fortress of orthodoxy, a regional headquarters in the war on heresy. It was typically attached to a Dominican convent, its somber stone walls concealing offices, archives, and of course, the ever-present dungeons. From these centers, the inquisitors and their agents fanned out into the surrounding countryside, conducting visitations, gathering intelligence, and hauling suspects back for interrogation. No village was too remote, no city too powerful to escape their scrutiny. The hounds of the Lord were everywhere. The key to their terrifying reach was a vast and pervasive network of informants. The Inquisition did not rely on its own members alone. It co-opted the entire community into its surveillance operations. Every citizen was legally obligated to report any suspicion of heresy to the tribunal. Failure to do so was a mortal sin and a crime. This duty was drilled into the populace through sermons and public announcements. The system was buttressed by an official organization of lay associates known as familiars. These were not priests or monks, but local citizens, often minor nobles, merchants, or artisans, who were granted special privileges, such as the right to bear arms and immunity from local prosecution, in exchange for serving as the Inquisition's eyes, ears, and muscle. They acted as bodyguards, informants, and arresting officers, a secret police hiding in plain sight. This created a society saturated with paranoia. A careless word at a tavern, a book read in private, a failure to attend church with sufficient regularity, anything could be reported. A personal grudge or a business rivalry could easily be settled by a secret denunciation to the local familiar. The tribunals were flooded with accusations, many of them baseless, but each had to be investigated, drawing more and more people into the system's maw. Cities and towns were torn apart by suspicion. In this architecture of fear, the most terrifying space was not the dungeon, but the gap between neighbors, the silence between friends, the quiet calculations behind a family member's eyes. Would you be able to betray your neighbor to save your family from the suspicion of an inquisitor? This ever-expanding network was not cheap to run. It required buildings, notaries, guards, and executioners. And this is where the vow of poverty met the reality of power. The Inquisition was designed to be entirely self-financing, and its primary source of income was the confiscation of the property of the condemned. When a person was convicted of heresy, their entire estate, their house, their land, their money, their possessions, was seized. The rules of this holy plunder were meticulously laid out. Typically, 1/3 of the confiscated wealth went to the local secular ruler who carried out the executions, 1/3 went to the papal treasury, and 1/3 went directly to the Inquisition itself to fund its operations. This final third made the Dominican tribunals incredibly wealthy. The economic incentive was a corrupting poison at the heart of the institution. The hunt for heretics became, in many places, a hunt for wealth. It is no coincidence that the Inquisition's activities were often most intense in prosperous regions with a wealthy merchant class like northern Italy and southern France. Accusations of heresy became a tool for dispossessing the rich. Wealthy individuals once accused had little hope. Even if they confessed and repented, their property was still forfeit. The system created a perverse incentive. The more heretics an inquisitor burned, the more financially secure his tribunal became. The Dominican Order, founded on the principle of begging for bread, became one of the largest landowners and administrators of confiscated assets in Europe. This greed inevitably led to abuses and sparked popular resistance. In some cities, citizens revolted against the inquisitors, seeing them not as guardians of the faith, but as rapacious predators. In 1306, the people of Albi in southern France stormed the Inquisition's headquarters, enraged by the mass arrests and seizures of property. In Parma, Italy, a tribunal was burned to the ground by an angry mob, but such revolts were rare and usually brutally suppressed. The combined power of the Church and the state was too great to overcome. For most, resistance was futile. The only options were to submit, to flee, or to die. The stories of those who tried to escape are the stuff of legend. There were secret networks that helped accused heretics flee across borders, moving at night, using codes and safe houses. There are records of inquisitorial agents hunting these fugitives across the continent, tracking them for years with dogged persistence. To the Inquisition, a heretic at large was not just a lost soul, but a stolen asset, an account left unsettled. The reach of their bureaucratic memory was long. A man who had fled Toulouse as a youth could be arrested as an old man in Sicily, his case file waiting patiently for him in the local tribunal's archive. The architecture of fear was now complete. A pan-European network of tribunals, staffed by highly trained Dominican specialists, funded by the assets of its victims, and supported by a pervasive surveillance system of local informants. It was a self-perpetuating machine. The more property it confiscated, the more powerful it became, and the more people it could afford to investigate, condemn, and dispossess. It was an institution that held the power of life and death, of salvation and damnation, of poverty and wealth, and it had become the shadow government of Christendom. And in one corner of Europe, this machine was about to be fused with the power of an emerging nation-state, creating a hybrid of religious fanaticism and political terror, unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Spanish fury was about to be unleashed. Imagine you're a wealthy merchant in 15th century Seville. The Inquisition arrests your biggest competitor. Do you celebrate your good fortune? Or do you pack your bags and flee? Let us know what you do. Post your answer. Celebrate or flee. We're dying to know your business strategy. The Spanish Inquisition was a different beast. While it drew its personnel and its methods from the Dominican-led papal model, its master was not the Pope in Rome, but the King in Madrid. It was born in the unique crucible of Spanish history, the centuries-long Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from its Muslim rulers. By the late 15th century, the process was nearly complete. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had united the two largest Christian kingdoms. Their final goal was to forge a single, unified, purely Catholic Spain. But their new kingdom was a complex mosaic of peoples, Christians, Muslims, and a large, influential Jewish population. For centuries, a tense but often productive coexistence, the convivencia, had prevailed. That was about to end. Pressure on the Jewish community had been mounting for a century, culminating in pogroms and mass-forced conversions. These new Christians, or conversos, became a new and suspect class within Spanish society. Many achieved great success in business, academia, and even the church, but they were perpetually viewed with suspicion by the old Christians. Were they true believers, or were they secretly practicing Judaism, Judaizing, as it was called? Ferdinand and Isabella, shrewd and ruthless monarchs, saw this religious anxiety as both a threat and an opportunity. A threat to their vision of a unified Catholic state, and an opportunity to seize the wealth of the converso elite and eliminate a powerful, independent segment of society. They petitioned the Pope for their own Inquisition, and in 1478 it was granted. The man chosen to be the first Inquisitor General was a Dominican friar, the Queen's own confessor, a figure whose name would become synonymous with religious terror, Tomás de Torquemada. He was a man of contradictions, personally ascetic and incorruptible, yet the architect of a system of mass plunder. He was a brilliant administrator and a legal pedant, yet his work plunged Spain into a nightmare of paranoia and bloodshed. Torquemada was not merely a priest, he was a state builder. He took the existing inquisitorial model and refined it into an instrument of absolute royal power. The Spanish Inquisition, or the Suprema as its governing council was known, became a state within a state with its own army of familiars, its own prisons, and its own vast bureaucracy, all dedicated to enforcing religious and, by extension, political uniformity. The primary targets were the conversos. The Inquisition developed an obsession with rooting out clandestine Jewish practices. Inquisitors published edicts listing the signs of a secret Judaizer, lighting candles on a Friday night, refusing to eat pork, washing hands before prayer, giving a child a Hebrew name. Neighbors were encouraged to spy on neighbors, servants on their masters. A single denunciation was enough to trigger an arrest. The methods were the same as the medieval Inquisition: secret accusations, no defense, torture to extract confession, but they were applied with a new bureaucratic efficiency and on an industrial scale. The property of the condemned was seized, enriching the crown and funding the Inquisition's ever-growing apparatus. The climax of the Spanish Inquisition's work was the auto da fe. Torquemada transformed this ceremony into a grandiose and terrifying public spectacle. It was a macabre festival of power, held in the central plaza of a city, presided over by the highest authorities of church and state. Thousands would watch as a long procession of condemned prisoners snaked through the streets, wearing their sanbenitos, painted with flames and devils. Their sentences were read, and those condemned to death were handed over to be burned. These events were meant to be a public cleansing, a demonstration of the monarchy's piety and its absolute control. For the victims, it was the final, agonizing humiliation. For the spectators, it was a chilling lesson in the price of dissent. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to the New World, Ferdinand and Isabella, advised by Torquemada, took the final step. They issued the Alhambra decree ordering all remaining Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country within 4 months. They could not take their gold, silver, or valuables with them. It was an act of mass ethnic and religious cleansing. An estimated 50,000 converted, becoming a new generation of suspect conversos for the Inquisition to prey upon. More than 100,000 fled, creating the Sephardic diaspora across the Mediterranean and beyond. A few years later, the remaining Muslim population was given the same choice: convert or be exiled. Spain had achieved its unity, but at the cost of its cultural and economic vitality, and it had created a black legend of intolerance and cruelty that would haunt its reputation for centuries. Torquemada presided over this reign of terror for 15 years. It is estimated that he was personally responsible for the burning of at least 2,000 people and the persecution of tens of thousands more. He was not a simple monster. He was a true believer, utterly convinced that he was saving Spain and the souls of its people from eternal damnation. He believed that purity could only be achieved through purging, that unity required the excision of all foreign elements. He was the dark knight of a doctrine that saw difference as disease. In his fanatical pursuit of a monolithic faith, he set a precedent for the modern totalitarian state, demonstrating how a secret police, an official ideology, and the apparatus of terror could be used to remold an entire society. The Spanish Inquisition's obsession with purity of blood, limpieza de sangre, added a new and sinister racial dimension to religious persecution. It was no longer enough to be a good Catholic. One had to have a pure Catholic lineage, free from any Jewish or Muslim taint. People began to obsessively trace their genealogies, seeking to prove their status as old Christians. A rumor of a converso ancestor could ruin a career or a marriage. This toxic fusion of race and religion would have a long and dark legacy in European history. The hounds of the Lord in Spain were no longer just hunting heretical ideas, they were hunting bloodlines. But even as the Spanish Inquisition perfected its methods for hunting human beings, a new panic was brewing in the heart of Europe. It was a fear that was older and more primal than theological disputes. It was the fear of the night, of dark magic, of a hidden conspiracy working to subvert God's creation. The intellectual machinery of the Inquisition, designed to dissect complex heresies, was about to be turned upon a new enemy, the witch. And 2 German Dominicans were busy writing the book that would provide the justification and the instruction manual for the slaughter to come. The witch hunts were about to begin, and the Dominicans held the hammer. The great European witch hunt was not a spontaneous eruption of peasant superstition. It was an intellectual construct, a theory of demonic conspiracy painstakingly assembled by theologians and jurists. And the single most influential text in this deadly enterprise, the book that became the field manual for generations of witch hunters, was written by 2 Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger. Published in 1487, its title was the Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for the Hammer of Witches. It was a book that systematized folklore, misogyny, and fear into a theological and legal framework for persecution. It was an instruction manual for a genocide against women. Kramer and Sprenger's argument was terrifyingly simple. They asserted, with the full weight of their scholastic learning, that witchcraft was not a collection of folk superstitions, but the worst of all possible heresies. A witch, they argued, was a person, most often a woman, who had made a formal pact with the devil, renouncing their Christian faith in exchange for supernatural powers. This demonic conspiracy, they claimed, was everywhere, working in secret to cause storms, kill livestock, spread disease, and render men impotent. The Malleus was a declaration of war against this invisible enemy. It was a call to arms for a new kind of crusade, one fought not in faraway lands, but in the villages and households of Europe. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first is a lengthy theological argument proving the existence of witches and the reality of their powers, refuting anyone who dared to claim it was all just fantasy. The second is a catalogue of the various horrors witches supposedly inflicted, a pornographic litany of demonic sex, cannibalistic infanticide, and magical curses. The third section is the most infamous. It is a detailed, step-by-step guide on how to prosecute a witch. It covers everything from how to initiate a trial and interrogate witnesses to the specific tortures that should be used to extract a confession. The Malleus insisted that because witchcraft was a crimen exceptum, an exceptional crime, ordinary legal procedures did not apply. Suspects could be denied legal counsel, and even a rumor was sufficient grounds to begin an investigation. The book's misogyny is relentless and pathological. Women, the authors argue, are naturally more prone to witchcraft because they are more carnal, more credulous, and intellectually weaker than men. They are, in the words of the text, a foe to friendship, an inescapable punishment, a necessary evil. The Malleus is filled with a visceral fear and hatred of female sexuality, which it views as the primary gateway for demonic influence. Midwives were particularly suspect, accused of offering newborn infants to the devil. Healers and wise women who had long practiced folk medicine were recast as diabolical agents. The book effectively criminalized entire spheres of traditional female knowledge and power. The devil promised man knowledge, but the Dominicans insisted it was woman who was the devil's preferred student. The timing of the Malleus was crucial. Its publication coincided with the invention of the printing press, which allowed it to be disseminated across Europe with unprecedented speed. It became an international bestseller, second only to the Bible in some regions. It lent an air of scholarly authority and papal approval. Kramer had craftily included a papal bull at the beginning of the book to what had been scattered and localized persecutions. It gave magistrates, priests, and princes both the justification and the practical means to launch their own witch hunts. The book did not start the fire, but it poured gasoline on the embers, helping to ignite the great witch craze that would consume Europe for the next 2 centuries, resulting in the trial of an estimated 100,000 people and the execution of perhaps 50,000, the vast majority of them women. The trials it inspired were Kafkaesque nightmares. The accused was trapped in a perfect logical circle. If they confessed to witchcraft, they were guilty. If they refused to confess, even under the most extreme torture, it was proof that the devil was giving them supernatural strength to resist, which also made them guilty. Inquisitors and secular judges following the Malleus looked for the devil's mark, a spot on the body insensitive to pain where the devil had supposedly branded his servant. Professional prickers would jab the accused's body with long needles. If they found a spot that didn't bleed or cause a reaction, it was taken as irrefutable proof. The accused were often stripped naked and shaved of all their body hair, a process of ritual humiliation designed to break them before the interrogation even began. The Dominican-led tribunals, which had previously focused on the fine points of theological doctrine, now found themselves presiding over cases involving flying ointments, demonic Sabbaths, and shape-shifting cats. The cold, scholastic logic that had been used to dissect Cathar dualism was now applied to the ravings of tortured, terrified women. The inquisitors filled their archives with thousands of pages of detailed confessions extracted under duress, describing the lurid details of their pacts with Satan. These confessions, in turn, were used as proof of the vast demonic conspiracy, fueling further panic and more accusations in a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle of hysteria. While the Dominicans were instrumental in creating the ideological framework for the witch hunts with the Malleus, the actual persecutions were a complex affair, often carried out by secular courts as much as by the Inquisition. In some areas, like Spain and Italy, the more legally rigorous Roman Inquisition was actually a restraining force, skeptical of the wilder accusations and demanding a higher standard of proof than local magistrates. But the damage had been done. The intellectual poison of the Malleus had seeped into the European mindset. The Dominicans had successfully identified a new enemy, an internal fifth column that could be blamed for every misfortune, from a failed crop to a sick child. This descent into legalized madness marks a dark turn in the Inquisition's story. The institution created to protect intellectual purity had become the champion of a paranoid superstition. The hounds of the Lord were no longer just hunting those who thought differently. They were hunting those who dreamed differently, those who lived on the margins, those who embodied a primal fear of the unknown. But even as the pyres for accused witches burned brightly across the continent, a new and far more potent threat to the Dominican worldview was emerging. It came not from the whispers of demons, but from the whirring of strange new machines, the careful observations of the night sky, and the audacious claim that humanity could understand the universe through reason without the mediation of the Church. The battle for reason was about to begin. A forbidden book is discovered in your city. It contains revolutionary ideas that could change the world, but are condemned as heresy. Do you report the book to the authorities to ensure order, or do you secretly read it to seek knowledge? Comment with your choice, order or knowledge. We promise not to check our records. The dawn of the 16th and 17th centuries brought a profound challenge to the Dominican-led system of control. The Renaissance had reawakened an interest in classical learning and human potential. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom, and the scientific revolution was beginning to chip away at the very foundations of the medieval cosmos. For the guardians of orthodoxy at the Roman Inquisition, reorganized in 1542 to combat the Protestant threat and still dominated by Dominican cardinals and theologians, this was the ultimate crisis. The enemy was no longer a scattered group of peasants or a coven of supposed witches, but the greatest minds of the age. The primary battlefield in this new war was the printing press. The same technology that had spread the Malleus Maleficarum was now disseminating the revolutionary ideas of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Nicholas Copernicus. The Vatican's response was to create a new weapon of intellectual warfare, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. First issued in 1559, the Index was a comprehensive list of all writings deemed dangerous to faith and morals. The Dominicans were central to its creation and enforcement. As masters of the Sacred Palace, the Pope's official theologians, they acted as the chief censors of the Catholic world. Their agents scoured the print shops and libraries of Europe, hunting not for people, but for dangerous ideas captured on paper. To own, read, or distribute a book on the Index was to risk a summons from the Inquisition. This was a declaration of war on free thought. The Index banned not only the works of Protestant reformers, but also the writings of humanists like Erasmus, political thinkers like Machiavelli, and eventually the scientific works that contradicted Scripture or Aristotelian physics. It was an attempt to build a firewall around the Catholic mind, to protect it from the contagion of new knowledge. The Inquisition became a thought police, and its Dominican agents were tasked with patrolling the frontiers of the human intellect. They staged public book burnings, raided clandestine printing presses, and interrogated scholars who dared to correspond with their Protestant counterparts across the Alps. It was a desperate and ultimately doomed attempt to hold back the tide of modernity. The most famous battles in this war were fought over the structure of the heavens. In the year 1600, a man was burned at the stake in Rome's Campo de' Fiori, the Square of Flowers. His name was Giordano Bruno. A brilliant, defiant, and deeply unconventional thinker, he had once been a Dominican friar himself. He had fled the order, wandering Europe and developing a philosophy that was a heady mix of mysticism, Hermeticism, and the new cosmology of Copernicus. He argued that the universe was infinite, that the stars were other suns, and that there were countless other worlds possibly inhabited. These ideas were profoundly heretical, as they displaced humanity and the earth from the center of God's creation. After being lured back to Italy, he was arrested by the Inquisition, imprisoned for 7 years, and relentlessly interrogated. He refused to recant his core beliefs. His execution was a brutal message to the world. There were ideas so dangerous that they warranted death. A generation later, the Inquisition faced an even greater challenge in the form of Galileo Galilei. Unlike Bruno, Galileo was not a speculative philosopher, but a brilliant experimental scientist. Using the newly invented telescope, he had gathered overwhelming evidence for the Copernican sun-centered model of the solar system. He saw the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the mountains on the moon, observations that shattered the old, perfect crystalline heavens of Aristotle and the Church. The leading Dominican theologians of the Collegio Romano initially engaged with him, but the forces of reaction quickly gained the upper hand. In 1616, the Holy Office, under Dominican influence, declared the Copernican theory to be foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. Galileo was warned to abandon the theory. But in 1632, he published his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a masterful, if thinly veiled, defense of the Copernican view. The aged and ailing scientist was summoned to Rome to face the Inquisition. The trial was a sham. Under threat of torture, broken in spirit, Galileo knelt before the cardinals and formally abjured, cursed, and detested his own discoveries. He was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. The condemnation of Galileo became a lasting symbol of the conflict between science and dogmatic religion. It was a tragic victory for the Dominican guardians of the old world. They had managed to silence the greatest scientist of the age, but they could not silence the truth. As Galileo supposedly muttered after his recantation, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. This battle for reason showed the Inquisition in its final, desperate form. Its purpose was no longer just to ensure theological conformity, but to preserve an entire, crumbling worldview. The Dominicans, who had once been at the forefront of European intellectual life at the great universities, had become the gatekeepers of a closed system, the defenders of a static and moribund truth. They were fighting against the very spirit of inquiry that had once been their hallmark. Their scholastic logic, once a tool for subtle dissection, had become a blunt instrument for crushing new ideas. They had chosen certainty over discovery, and in doing so they had placed themselves on the wrong side of history. While this epic struggle between faith and reason unfolded in the heart of Europe, the Inquisition was also busy exporting its model of control across the oceans. The Spanish and Portuguese empires were expanding across the globe, and wherever the conquistadors went, the cross and the Dominican Inquisitor followed close behind. The architecture of fear, perfected over centuries in the cities of Europe, was about to be transplanted to a new and vastly different world, where it would be used not just to police the beliefs of Europeans, but to subjugate and control entire civilizations. The Dark Knights of Doctrine were setting sail for the New World. The arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese in the Americas was not just a military conquest, it was a spiritual one. The cross and the sword worked in tandem. The primary justification for the brutal subjugation of the indigenous peoples was the sacred duty to save their souls by converting them to Christianity. But how to ensure that these mass conversions were sincere? How to prevent the old gods from re-emerging in the guise of Catholic saints? The answer, inevitably, was the Inquisition. By the mid-16th century, formal tribunals of the Holy Office were established in the major colonial centers: Lima in Peru, Mexico City in New Spain, and Cartagena in what is now Colombia. Their mandate was vast: to protect the faith of the colonists, to root out Protestant heretics and crypto-Jews among the new arrivals, and to police the religious practices of the newly converted indigenous population. The inquisitors who crossed the Atlantic, many of them Spanish Dominicans, found themselves in a world that defied their categories. They were confronted with complex civilizations, ancient traditions, and spiritual beliefs of bewildering variety. Their response was to see the face of the devil everywhere. They viewed the Aztec, Inca, and Maya religions not as legitimate faiths, but as demonic parodies of Christianity. They saw human sacrifice, complex pantheons, and shamanistic rituals as evidence of a massive satanic conspiracy that had held the entire continent in its thrall for centuries. The conquest was therefore not just a war for gold and land, but a holy exorcism. One of the Inquisition's first tasks was an act of massive cultural genocide. The friars, in their zeal to erase the pagan past, systematically destroyed the cultural records of the conquered peoples. Most famously in the Yucatan, the Franciscan bishop Diego de Landa, acting with the spirit of an inquisitor, orchestrated the burning of nearly all the sacred books of the Maya in 1562. These codices, containing centuries of knowledge in astronomy, history, and religion, were deemed to be superstition and lies of the devil. Similar acts of destruction occurred throughout the Americas. It was an attempt to wipe the slate clean, to erase the memory of the old gods and impose a new, singular history and worldview. It was intellectual suppression on a continental scale. While native peoples were initially subject to the Inquisition, the sheer scale of the task and a lingering theological debate about their spiritual maturity led the authorities to place them largely under the jurisdiction of bishops. The full force of the tribunals in Lima and Mexico City was therefore focused on the European and mixed-race populations. They hunted for secret Jews among the Portuguese merchants, for English pirates accused of being Lutheran heretics, and for colonists who dared to dabble in folk magic or express unorthodox opinions. Life in the colonial cities was a claustrophobic affair, where every word could be reported to the familiars of the Holy Office. The Inquisition was a key instrument of colonial control, enforcing social and political conformity under the guise of religious purity. The Inquisition in the New World also found itself fighting a new kind of heresy, syncretism. The indigenous and African slave populations did not simply abandon their old beliefs. Instead, they cleverly and resiliently blended them with the Catholicism they were forced to adopt. An African deity might be worshipped in the guise of a Catholic saint. An ancient Andean mountain spirit, or Apu, might be prayed to at a shrine dedicated to the Virgin Mary. To the Dominicans, this was a devilish contamination of the true faith. They launched campaigns to root out these idolatries, sending inquisitorial visitors to remote villages to interrogate the inhabitants, destroy their sacred objects, and punish the local shamans and healers. These campaigns were often brutal, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. The syncretic faiths of Latin America survived, a testament to the enduring power of cultural resistance. The vast distances and exotic settings of the New World gave the Inquisition's work an almost adventurous quality. We have records of inquisitors leading expeditions deep into the jungle to destroy a hidden shrine, or chasing pirate ships rumored to be carrying banned Protestant Bibles. They were the spiritual frontiersmen of a global empire, pushing the boundaries of their authority into uncharted territory. But the core of their work remained the same as it had been in Europe: the secret interrogation, the application of torture, and the public humiliation of the auto da fe in the grand plazas of Mexico City and Lima. The architecture of fear had been successfully exported and rebuilt, a grim symbol of colonial power looming over a conquered world. For over 2 centuries, the Inquisition's power in the Americas seemed absolute, but back in Europe, the world was changing. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment were beginning to erode the very foundations upon which the Inquisition's authority rested. Philosophers were championing reason, tolerance, and individual liberty, ideas that were pure poison to the dogmatic certainty of the Holy Office. The Dominicans and their terrible machine, which had ruled the European conscience for 500 years, were about to face their most formidable enemy yet. Not a heretic, not a witch, not a scientist, but a revolution that would sweep across the continent, armed with a new and terrifyingly effective weapon, the guillotine. The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, was a disaster for the Inquisition. Its intellectual foundations were ridiculed by the leading thinkers of the day. In his influential philosophical dictionary and other writings, the French philosopher Voltaire made the Inquisition his favorite target. He portrayed it as the ultimate symbol of Catholic fanaticism, superstition, and cruel intolerance. His biting satire, disseminated in countless books and pamphlets, turned the institution into a laughingstock among the educated elite of Europe. The image of the grim black-robed Dominican inquisitor passing judgment on free thinkers became a stock character in the horror stories of the Enlightenment. The Inquisition's power rested on fear and awe. Ridicule was a weapon against which it had no defense. The political ground was also shifting beneath the Inquisitors' feet. A new generation of enlightened despots, European monarchs like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph II of Austria, were centralizing their states and had little patience for an independent religious authority operating within their borders. Throughout Europe, the power of the Inquisition was curtailed. Secular governments took control of censorship, limited the tribunal's ability to make arrests, and intervened in their proceedings. The institution that had once brought kings to their knees was now being slowly strangled by the very state power it had helped create in places like Spain. It was becoming a relic, a ghost of a more savage age. The final fatal blow came from the French Revolution. Exploding in 1789, the revolution was fueled by a fierce anti-clericalism. The revolutionaries saw the Catholic Church as an integral part of the old regime of oppression and privilege. When the revolutionary armies of France, later led by Napoleon Bonaparte, began their conquest of Europe, they brought this ideology with them. Wherever they went, they systematically dismantled the structures of the old world, and for them, nothing symbolized that world more perfectly than the Inquisition. The invasion of Italy and Spain by Napoleon's armies in the early 19th century spelled the end for the great historical tribunals. As French soldiers entered a city, one of their first acts was often to march to the local headquarters of the Inquisition. They threw open the doors of its palaces, places that had been shrouded in secrecy and fear for centuries. They stormed the dungeons, freeing the handful of prisoners who remained, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight. They seized the archives, the vast paper memory of the institution, containing the records of countless trials and confessions extracted under torture. For the first time, the terrible secrets of the Inquisition were exposed to the public eye. The soldiers and local citizens who entered these buildings found shocking evidence of the Inquisition's grim work. They discovered torture chambers still containing racks, strapados, and other instruments of pain. In some places, they found the skeletal remains of prisoners chained to the walls of forgotten cells. These discoveries, widely reported in the press, confirmed the worst horror stories of the Enlightenment philosophers and forever sealed the Inquisition's reputation for monstrous cruelty. The storming of the Inquisition's palaces became a powerful symbolic act, representing the triumph of reason over fanaticism, of light over darkness. The Inquisitors themselves met various fates. Some fled, attempting to disappear into the chaos of the wars. Others desperately tried to destroy their archives, burning the records of their activities to protect their secrets and their identities. A few were captured by angry mobs and faced summary justice. Most simply faded away, their power gone, their authority vanished overnight. The Dominican Order, so long identified with this instrument of terror, found itself stripped of its most powerful and feared role. The hounds of the Lord had been muzzled, seemingly for good. The revolutions that swept across Europe and Latin America in the 19th century ensured that the tribunals would not be restored. In 1834, the Spanish Inquisition, the most powerful of them all, was formally abolished. The age of the Inquisitors was over. Or was it? The institution was dead, its buildings repurposed, its officials scattered. But a machine is more than just its physical parts. A machine is a design, a process, a way of thinking. The Dominican Inquisitors had created the world's first truly modern system of ideological control. They had perfected the techniques of surveillance, secret files, psychological manipulation, and bureaucratic terror. They had demonstrated how an organization with a claim to absolute truth could justify any cruelty in the pursuit of its utopia. The question that haunted the post-Napoleonic world was a chilling one. Had the Inquisition truly been destroyed, or had its ghost simply escaped the machine, free to possess new bodies? The formal abolition of the Inquisition tribunals in the 19th century was not the end of the story, it was a rebranding. In Rome, the nerve center of the global institution, the Papal Inquisition was never truly abolished. It simply changed its name. In 1908, it became the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office. In 1965, following the Second Vatican Council, it was reformed again and given the more benign-sounding title it holds to this day, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Its headquarters are still located in the same palace in Rome that once housed the Roman Inquisition. The archives containing the files of Bruno and Galileo are still there. The function is still the same, to protect and police the purity of Catholic doctrine. The methods have changed, the rack has been replaced by theological review boards and threats of silencing, but the mission of ideological control continues. The legacy of the Inquisition, however, extends far beyond the walls of the Vatican. Its methods and its mindset have outlived their creators, becoming a blueprint for secular tyrannies. The inquisitorial process, where a state-appointed official investigates a crime, amasses evidence in secret, and then acts as both prosecutor and judge, remains the basis for the legal systems of most of the world, a direct descendant of the tribunals perfected by the Dominicans. It stands in contrast to the adversarial system of common law, with its presumption of innocence and its trial by a jury of peers. Every time a French examining magistrate or a German state prosecutor builds a secret dossier against a suspect, they are walking in the footsteps of Bernard Guy. More chillingly, the techniques of the Inquisition became a model for the secret police forces of the 20th century's totalitarian states. The Gestapo, the KGB, the Stasi, all of them owed a deep, if unacknowledged, debt to the hounds of the Lord. The use of a vast network of citizen informants, the secret arrests in the dead of night, the isolation of prisoners, the psychological torture designed to break the will and secure a confession, the show trials where the verdict is known in advance, these were not new inventions. They were the perfection of a system pioneered 500 years earlier. The Dominican inquisitors proved that the most effective tool of control is not brute force, but fear and bureaucracy. They created the software of modern oppression. And what of the Dominican Order itself? Today, the Order of Preachers is known for its scholars, its universities, and its work for social justice. It has produced great theologians and thinkers who have championed human rights, yet it has never fully reckoned with the darkest chapter of its own history. The figures of Torquemada and Sprenger remain a part of their legacy, a reminder that the same intellectual rigor that can produce profound theology can also be used to justify profound cruelty. The Order is a living testament to the fact that the road to hell is often paved not with evil intentions, but with the unshakable conviction that one is doing God's work. The curse of the Inquisition is not that evil men did evil things, but that intelligent, pious men, in the name of a loving God, created a perfect machine for the suppression of the human spirit. The machine is now dismantled. Its Dominican operators have long since turned to dust, but its blueprints remain. Its logic echoes in our modern world. We no longer live in fear of the heretic's pyre, but we have created new systems of control, new forms of inquisition. We have built a digital world of total surveillance, where our every word and thought can be monitored and judged. We live in an age of ideological purity tests, of online mobs that hunt down and silence dissent, of cancel culture that acts as a modern auto-da-fe for those who stray from the ever-shifting dogmas of the day. The Inquisition has not vanished. It has simply taken off its Dominican habit and put on a digital mask. It has become a faceless algorithm, a righteous hashtag, a silent, creeping control that promises security in exchange for our freedom of thought. The Dominicans built their perfect machine to save souls, convinced that a single, absolute truth could save humanity from chaos. Today that machine lies in ruins, a monument to the dangers of fanaticism. But as we navigate a world of information warfare, total surveillance, and an endless battle of competing ideologies, a final question lingers. What is the greater threat to the human spirit, the open flames of the Inquisitor who believed he was saving your soul, or the silent algorithms of the modern world that simply want to control your mind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your answer matters more than you think.